data is processed by consent, by choice of the user. So there are conditions when you don't need to take the consent of the user. That is called the legitimate use, and we are going to talk about that as defined by the Indian DPDP Act in this video. Welcome to my YouTube channel where you daily see new content on data privacy, and as I mentioned, in this video we are going to talk about the legitimate use of personal data where no consent is required. We'll talk about processing of personal data in detail separately in separate videos, but let's talk about the situations where the legitimate use is allowed. So what is this legitimate use of data? We talked about processing of data. Processing of data means you collect the data, or you store, you use, you disclose, and you destroy the data. You do all of them, you are processing the data. You do all this with personal data which is identifiable to an individual, then you fall under the DPDP Act, right? And of course, DPDP Act says that it should also be also applies in case when it's a digital. It does not apply for the non-digital data, right? In normal circumstances, processing of personal information of any individual for any purpose requires a consent from the individual. But in case of legitimate use, what we are saying is that you don't need my permission. You don't need my consent to process my information. So you can process my information the way you want to process it. The very basic thing that always is to be remembered, that you cannot misuse my information. However, you can process it. When I say misuse, it means you are processing it with all the possible guidelines. The only thing you are missing is that you are not seeking my consent before processing the information, right? And the purpose should be very lawful and very necessary. And what are those circumstances or lawful purposes? Let's talk about those use cases. When the data is provided by the principal itself for a purpose, right? You are not going to ask for the information. They themselves say, okay, you are doing this. I also want this to be done. Here is my information. That's a consent, right? That qualifies under a consent. If the collection is not done by the processor or the authorized collectors for that matter, you don't need consent. Literally means that if the principal voluntarily shares his own personal information, then you don't need the consent. Any state activity for which or for a similar activity a previous consent was obtained, you don't need to seek consent again. State benefits like subsidies, government benefits, licenses, permits for doing some business or doing some activity. If you have applied for those things, the agencies will process your personal information. They won't ask you for consent to process the personal information. If the data has been collected by the agencies from any database, register, book, document, which was maintained by the state, right? The information is already with the state, and we are talking of state and central governments, right? Not the private agencies. So if the information is already with the state government, they can process it under the guidelines of the central government. That information can be processed without your consent. And if there are any legal obligations, that is, your information is required in a legal issue, or if there is a public interest activity, right? Infrastructure development, garbage cleaning, any such public interest activity, in these two circumstances also you don't need an explicit consent from the data principal. So the basic idea, activities under which you do not need explicit consent from the data principal are known as legitimate activities, and these are some of the use cases for the same. I hope you like the content of my video. Please press the bell and the like icon. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and share your feedback in the comment section. Thank you.